What if the fate of a superpower hinged not on missiles or tanks, but on a bottle of vodka? Picture Moscow, 1985. Snow falls on Red Square. Inside the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev raises a glass, not in celebration, but in warning. He's about to launch a campaign that will shake the Soviet Union to its core. For decades, vodka wasn't just a drink in Russia. It was a pillar of the economy, a social glue, and a quiet addiction. Every toast at a wedding, every deal in a smoky back room, every payday in a Leningrad factory. Vodka was there. It was so deeply woven into the fabric of Soviet life that it seemed untouchable. But Gorbachev saw a nation in crisis. Alcoholism was rampant. Productivity was falling. Families were breaking. So he made a choice: declare war on vodka. This wasn't just a public health initiative, it was an economic revolution. He would raise prices, cut production, destroy vineyards, and ban drinking in public parks and offices. It was a bold, almost unthinkable gamble. One that would cost the Kremlin billions, fuel a black market empire, and, as we'll see, help unravel the Soviet system itself. But to understand the sheer scale of this gamble, you have to go back in time, long before Gorbachev. Let's step into a crowded Moscow street in the 1970s. A line snakes around the corner, men and women stamping their feet against the biting cold, all waiting for the state liquor store to open. Inside, shelves gleam with bottles stamped with the hammer and sickle. Vodka, the very lifeblood of the Soviet economy. The story of Russia and vodka starts long before the Soviet flag ever flew. For centuries, Russian rulers, from the Tsars to the Commissars, understood a simple, powerful truth. Vodka wasn't just a drink, it was a revenue stream. By the 1970s, this wasn't just a small tax. Vodka sales made up nearly a third of the USSR's entire budget. Think about that. Every bottle sold helped pay for schools, hospitals, and even the tanks and rockets of the Cold War. State-run distilleries worked around the clock. Their output measured not just in liters, but in rubles for the treasury. Vodka was everywhere. Official toasts at party congresses, wedding feasts in village halls, quiet evenings in cramped city apartments. It was a social ritual, a coping mechanism, and a silent, unspoken contract between the people and the state. The government provided the vodka, and the people in turn funded the government. But this dependence came at a devastating cost. Throughout the Brezhnev era, alcoholism rates soared. Life expectancy for men began to decline. Productivity lagged as workers showed up hungover, or not at all. Yet no leader dared to break this vicious cycle. Tampering with vodka was like tampering with the foundations of the state itself. It was too risky, until one man decided the risk of doing nothing was even greater. Spring, 1985. A new wind of change sweeps through the Kremlin as Mikhail Gorbachev takes power, promising reform and renewal. He introduces perestroika and glasnost, words that echo around the world meaning restructuring and openness. But his very first battle isn't with foreign rivals or internal political factions. It's with the bottle. Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign is swift and dramatic. Vodka production is slashed by more than half. Famous vineyards in Crimea and Georgia, which produced wine and brandy, are literally uprooted. Liquor stores, once open all day, now have their hours drastically cut, opening only for a few hours in the afternoon. Prices soar overnight, putting a bottle of official vodka out of reach for many. The state propaganda machine goes into overdrive. Posters warn of the dangers of drinking. Films show the tragic consequences of alcoholism. Police begin to patrol parks, train stations, and even offices, searching for hidden bottles and fining people for public intoxication. Gorbachev, nicknamed the Mineral Water General Secretary, leads by example, toasting with juice or mineral water at state dinners. The initial results are immediate and chaotic. Official sales of alcohol plummet. And just as quickly, so does government revenue. The Soviet budget, which had been propped up for so long by vodka taxes, suddenly springs a massive leak. The state loses billions upon billions of rubles at the exact moment Gorbachev needs money to fund his ambitious economic reforms. This was a self-inflicted economic wound of staggering proportions. But the demand for alcohol didn't just disappear. It went underground. As the state stores emptied, A massive black market roared to life. This was the era of samagon, or moonshine. All across the Soviet Union, in kitchens and basements, people started distilling their own potent, often dangerous, concoctions. They used anything they could find: sugar, potatoes, grain, even wood pulp and shoe polish. The sugar market was thrown into chaos as people bought it up by the sackful, not for tea, but to ferment into illegal spirits. This shadow economy created a new class of underground millionaires, organized crime syndicates that controlled the production and distribution of illicit booze. The state lost control not just of its revenue, but of the alcohol supply itself. Instead of drinking regulated, state-produced vodka, people were now drinking mystery liquids of unknown purity and strength. Cases of poisoning skyrocketed. The social fabric also started to tear. The long lines outside the few open liquor stores became a daily spectacle of frustration. Fights broke out. People would wait for hours, only to find the shelves bare. This public anger wasn't just about the lack of vodka. It was a visible symbol of the state's failure. The government that promised to provide for its people couldn't even manage the supply of their national drink. For Gorbachev, the campaign became a political nightmare. He had hoped to create a sober, more productive workforce to power his reforms. Instead, he created budget deficits, fueled organized crime, and stoked widespread public resentment. The man who wanted to save the Soviet Union was now being blamed for taking away one of the few pleasures many people had. So, did the campaign have any positive effects? In the short term, yes. Statistics from the time show a remarkable, temporary drop in mortality rates. Life expectancy jumped up. There were fewer workplace accidents, fewer street crimes, and a brief baby boom. For a moment, it seemed like Gorbachev's gamble might actually be paying off in human terms. He had traded rubles for lives. But these gains were fleeting. As the black market grew, people went back to drinking, often consuming even more dangerous substances. The initial health benefits began to reverse. More importantly, the economic damage was irreversible. The massive budget hole created by the campaign weakened the central government at a critical time. As Gorbachev tried to push through his other reforms, he found himself starved of cash. He had to borrow from the West, increasing the USSR's foreign debt. The economic instability made it harder to manage the growing political unrest across the republics. Historians now argue that the anti-alcohol campaign was a major destabilizing factor that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. By trying to fix one problem, Gorbachev inadvertently helped dismantle the entire system. By 1988, facing economic disaster and public fury, Gorbachev was forced to retreat. The restrictions were eased, and vodka began to flow more freely again. But it was too late. The economic damage was done, and the authority of the state had been severely undermined. The genie of the black market was out of the bottle, and it couldn't be put back in. The story of Gorbachev's war on vodka is a fascinating and tragic lesson in unintended consequences. It shows how a single policy, born from good intentions, can spiral out of control in a complex system. He wanted to cure the sickness of a nation, but in doing so, he may have accidentally killed the patient. The Soviet Union, already burdened with deep structural problems, couldn't survive the shock. The empty state coffers, the public anger, the rise of criminal empires, it all contributed to the chain of events that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. A superpower's fate sealed not by a nuclear war, but by a struggle over a simple bottle of vodka. It's a powerful reminder that history is often driven by the small, everyday things that define a culture. The thirst didn't just vanish. Instead, it went underground. Homemade moonshine, known as samagon, started flowing from kitchens and garages all across the country. Black markets didn't just appear, they thrived. Bribes and corruption spread like wildfire as people did whatever it took, absolutely whatever, to get their hands on a drink. Public resentment grew day by day. The lines for the little legal alcohol that was available stretched for blocks, longer than anyone had ever seen. Sure, some people cheered for the campaign. They held on to the hope of a healthier, more sober nation. But many more grumbled. They felt punished, policed, and patronized. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union found itself tangled in a massive paradox. Officially, vodka sales had plummeted. But unofficially, the streets were practically awash in homemade spirits. Imagine this. In cramped city apartments and remote rural sheds, secret stills were bubbling away through the night. The state, which had once held a complete monopoly as the sole supplier of alcohol, had lost its grip on its single most profitable business. The financial consequences were staggering. Estimates suggest the government lost billions of rubles in tax revenue. This wasn't just spare change. This was money that once funded everything from pensions for the elderly to the construction of power plants. And where there's a vacuum, something always rushes in to fill it. In this case, it was organized crime. Criminal syndicates stepped up, running vast underground networks that supplied the nation's unquenchable thirst for alcohol. Bribery and corruption became routine, a part of daily life. Officials either looked the other way, or more often than not, took a cut of the profits for themselves. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens felt the squeeze. Wages stagnated, the prices of everyday goods started to rise. The social safety net that people had relied on for decades began to fray at the edges. The budget crisis just kept getting deeper, leaving the government scrambling to find money to fill the ever-widening gap. Public trust, a cornerstone of any society, eroded rapidly. A deep-seated frustration simmered just below the surface, waiting for a spark. This raises some big questions. What really happens when a state loses control of its most profitable business? How did a simple budget crisis spiral into a political earthquake that shook the foundations of a superpower? Was this war on vodka the final fatal straw? Or was it just a symptom of a much deeper, more systemic unraveling that was already well underway? History has a funny way of repeating itself, sometimes with just a different label on the bottle. Let's rewind the clock and jump across the ocean to America in the 1920s. A similar story unfolds. Prohibition sweeps the nation, banning the sale and consumption of alcohol, all in the name of public health and morality. But did America become a sober utopia? Not quite. Instead, it got secret speakeasies, notorious bootleggers like Al Capone, and a booming, violent black market. The slogans were different. The uniforms had changed. But the outcome was eerily familiar. A top-down, heavy-handed campaign designed to control a national habit only succeeded in driving it underground. This, in turn, fueled organized crime, corrupted law enforcement, and drained the national treasury of vital tax revenue. So, what's the big takeaway from Gorbachev's war on vodka? It serves as a powerful warning about the hidden dangers of sudden, top-down economic change. It's especially risky when a policy, no matter how well-intentioned it might seem, collides head-on with deep-rooted cultural habits and powerful hidden incentives. We see how a single policy can send ripples, or rather shockwaves, through an entire system. It can create sprawling black markets out of thin air, punch massive holes in a national budget, and trigger political earthquakes that can change the course of history. Can a single policy, a single decision, really topple a superpower? The answers are all there, hidden in the past, if you just know where to look and how to connect the dots. If you enjoyed this deep dive into cinematic economic history, make sure you subscribe. We'll explore how small decisions can shake empires and change the world. And you won't want to miss our next episode, the currency collapse that sent the global economy into a tailspin. Thanks for watching.